So my name is Natalija. I'm from Ndevr Environmental. We're a sustainability and climate change consultancy in Australia. And yeah, thanks everyone for coming along. So what are we talking about today? I'll be showing you a practical approach on what is carbon accounting and how that leads to managing business consumption, and in the long term, how to footprint and what other kind of things that it leads to. So there we go. Okay, just getting my slides ready. So what are we running through today? So the approach, what is carbon accounting? So I'll take you through some background on what it is and how it works. We'll go through briefly what emission scopes are, how they're defined and what they are. They're a very core principle in carbon accounting. And then how does that apply to tourism? We'll go through some examples and case studies for a tour operator, for a hotel, for a restaurant. And then we'll bring it all back to how does this manage business consumption in terms of energy, water and waste, and what it can lead to in setting up this framework at your business, what it can lead to in the long term. So what is carbon accounting? So carbon accounting, or also known as greenhouse gas accounting, is a set of methods on how to measure and manage the amount of greenhouse gases emitted by an entity. So this can be an organization, a country, or individuals, but it can also extend to products, services, buildings, or even events. So the international framework that sets how to do this is known as the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which was launched in 1998 by the World Resources Institute and the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. It supplies the world's most widely used greenhouse gas accounting standards, and these standards form the basis for many other industry or country-specific frameworks that have been developed since. And why are we interested in measuring emissions? Because we need to manage the harmful impacts of human-induced climate change. And you can't manage what you don't measure, of course. So the sources of emissions in a business or an organization's activities are defined as 3 sources or scopes. So these are the same definitions for any organization, regardless of the business type or sector. Every company has a defined scope 1, 2, and 3 emission sources, but the actual activities that occur in those sources are very different between companies. So scope 1, which you can see in green on that diagram, these are known as direct emissions from sources which a company owns or controls. So if you were to draw a boundary around, if you were to draw a boundary around your company, or, the kind of things that you do physically in the world, if you drew a boundary around that, you could literally see, if you could see greenhouse gases, if you could actually see them, they'd be rising up from your business. They come from the direct operations of your business. Then everything else that's not scope 1 is scope 2 or scope 3 is indirect. So these are things that occur in your value chain, in your in the wider business ecosystem that you operate in. Scope 2 itself is a special one for indirect emissions from electricity consumption. So this is a special one that was made because electricity is so abundant and everyone needs it, and there's a very specific way to account it. So they made a specific scope for that. Then everything else that's not electricity and it's not scope 1 falls under scope 3. And on that diagram there are 15 categories under the framework, under the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which define what these things are for a company. And they're all of them there. And not all of those categories always apply to every company. So depending on the framework and what applies to you, you see what applies to you as a company. And later on, I'll go into some more specific examples of scope 1, 2, and 3 for tourism companies. Okay, so how does this framework, how's carbon accounting applied to tourism? So here you can see at the top a breakdown of the general process and then some tourism specific questions that you would ask at each stage. So the first one is establishing the boundary, and this happens at the very start of setting up these frameworks. So these are imaginary lines encompassing the emissions to include in an organization's greenhouse gas inventory. This can be quite a complex process in itself, and there are different approaches depending on the type of organization. But the most common way of establishing a boundary is through the definition of operational control. So what do you operate and own as a company? And this is the best and the most common approach for most businesses, and including tourism businesses as well. Defining a boundary is twofold. There is the boundary of your organization emissions, so anything to do to run your business, for example, office activities and locations. And then there's a boundary of the service or the product that you're providing. So for a tour operator, for example, this is the trips service that they offer to customers. Again, the question of operational control applies in setting all these boundaries. Emissions are measured year on year over time to track progress. And the first year that these emissions measurements are set up is known as the base year. And this is usually the most recent applicable year, and it can be calendar year or financial year. Companies would not go back and establish a base year in 2005 because it's just not reflective of current business activities. Next, you would look at the types of business activities that occur to conduct your day-to-day operations. And this is how you begin to identify the emission sources, and I'll go into some examples shortly. After you've identified the emission sources and they've been mapped, then you start to assess, okay, so what type of data do we have to start these calculations? And most businesses usually have most of the data that they need for the really big, important sources. So here are some examples of emission sources by tourism business type. We have the tour operator, the hotel, and a restaurant. Note that the emission sources shown are likely only the major ones. There would also be other sources for each business here too, but for now we'll only focus on the major ones. Also shown in brackets is the assumed emission scope 1, 2, or 3 for each of those sources. So firstly, for the tour operator, a scope 1 source example would be the fuel used and combusted in the van to drive your customers around on a trip. Note, it would be scope 1 if the van was owned and operated, if the van was owned by the company and they had the logo on it and whatnot. But if the tour operator didn't own the van and they used a supplier or a third-party contractor to provide the van, then this would fall under scope 3. The data for this source could be from fuel cards that the company uses for employees to fill up, or from dockets from filling up. So then any electricity used in accommodation would be scope 2. And data for this could be hard to get. So in that case, the amount of electricity could be estimated. This occurs sometimes in carbon accounting. We can't get the exact data from everything because it sits with the supplier. So in these cases, which they do come up quite often, there are estimation allowances built into the framework to deal with these situations. Next, for the tour operator, any waste generated on the trip is an example as well, and this would fall under scope 3. And again, this may be hard to measure, so a conservative estimation would be made with the aim to improve the accuracy of this data point over time. For a hotel, a scope 1 source example would be the natural gas burnt to heat the rooms. And this data point would typically be from gas invoices from the supplier. And the hotel would have this because, you know, they own the hotel, they pay the bills, the electricity, so the gas is being sent there. A similar example for fuels for vans, where perhaps a van picks up patrons from the airport and brings them back to the hotel. And the same with electricity, where that data point would exist in hotel invoices because the hotel is paying for it. The amount of water would also be another example of a scope 3 source, and this would come in on invoices. And with waste, hopefully your waste provider is sophisticated enough to tell you how much waste is generated by type and the amount. Some waste providers provide analytics and portals on that. But again, if this data is not available, then conservative approximations can be made. And lastly, for the restaurant, natural gas and electricity, similar considerations for the hotel, and they'll come from invoices, and similar considerations for the waste as well. So overall, apart from being examples of potential emission sources for these 3 types, what we're interested in gathering from these data points is the amount of consumption of your business. So for example, the amount of electricity used in kilowatt hours, or the amount of fuel used in kiloliters over a set period of time. Once that data is collected, each data point would then be applied to something known as an emission factor to then calculate the amount of emissions. And in Q&A time, I have an example to show you if you'd like to see that. So here are examples of 2 companies that Ndevr has worked with to help them attain Climate Active certification, which is an Australian federal government carbon neutral scheme and the only government-backed carbon neutral certification in the world. ATE is a street food provider with their kiosk located in Fed Square, Melbourne. They have been certified Climate Active carbon neutral since 2020. And if you're ever in Melbourne, so sometime in 2022, at this rate, definitely try their yummy carbon neutral Lebanese street food. And on the other end of the spectrum in terms of size, we have Intrepid, who we've been working with for a number of years now. They've been carbon neutral since 2010, but have been Climate Active certified since 2018. And last year, we also helped Intrepid develop its science-based target, which is the first in the world for a tour operator. And shortly, I'll explain what carbon neutrality and science-based targets are. But what I want to highlight here is that the same framework for carbon accounting is used across both these companies, albeit in different applications because they're different sizes. So the message here is that the framework is accessible for everyone. So the calculations are usually done in Excel that we build, or a carbon accountant builds, and using this data that the company already has. So for example, invoices from electricity, gas, water. The approach is accessible and affordable for all, and it's done at a scale that fits your organization. So you don't need some fancy program or software to run these calculations. Only a knowledge of how it is done and what is the right approach for you. So tying this back to helping manage consumption and the topic of today's presentation. So the data needed for emissions calculations are tied to operational data points which dictate how much energy and water is consumed by a business, as well as the amount of waste generated, amongst many other things. So for major sources, you already have this data and are able to measure it. Shown here is an example of a company's historical emissions profile. So by measuring emissions year on year through carbon accounting, a business is also able to track its consumption. And seeing this as a business really helps to make decisions to eventually reduce that consumption and become more operationally efficient in the long term. And naturally, this leads to cost savings as well. And usually sustainability, operational efficiencies, cost savings, they usually go hand in hand. So apart from tracking consumption and informing cost savings in the long term, measuring emissions can also lead to other initiatives, such as, for example, emission reduction targets. So the gold standard of setting an emissions reduction target these days is known as the Science-Based Target Initiative, which is an international body that runs the verification for set targets. And last year we helped Intrepid develop and submit theirs and be verified and validated under the program. Another thing that carbon accounting could lead to is climate active carbon neutral certification, which is in Australia. And this is where the greenhouse gas footprint of a business is offset by buying carbon credit units from the carbon market. Over the longer term, net zero pathways and strategies to 2050 can be developed and informed through carbon accounting. And this helps inform how to decarbonize your business and transition to a low carbon future. And finally, measuring emissions helps inform other sustainability initiatives and strategies, because you are essentially gathering the same data points to inform things such as resource management, so water and energy reduction strategies, waste reduction strategies, and environmental and ESG reporting, which can be external or internal as well, or sustainability KPIs and internal metrics. So overall, there is more to this than being a way to improve operations and manage consumption. Carbon accounting also is the start of a business's journey for action on climate change and business sustainability. And this is becoming much more important to consumers. It's becoming a value differentiator between businesses. Shifting your business to more sustainable practices isn't just good for the earth as well, it's good for the bottom line too, because of a lot of efficiencies and cost savings that are realized. So carbon accounting is a practical and accessible approach that will help manage your business consumption. It'll measure your impacts on climate change and help show your customers as well that you take sustainability seriously. So thank you everyone for listening. I really appreciate your time and your interest, and I'd love to hear any questions that you have.
Thanks, Natalija. Great presentation. Yeah, we've got a question. Awesome. Just to let you know, Natalija, we did have a couple of people that had to leave for appointments, but we've still got a couple of questions here for you. So I'll pass it over.
Hello. So I work from a home office in a home. So with the calculations, how do you break down electricity for your portion of electricity?
Yes, so that's a new thing that's come up last year. Yeah, so if you work in a home office, there's definitely ways to do it. You don't sit there and measure exactly the amount of time that you spend at your desk working, personal time versus working time. There are approximations made, and in these kind of situations where the best data isn't always available, you make a conservative estimation to account for that. So, but for example, if you had your electricity bill for the year, you could say how much time you spent working a given week, and then sum that up and say, okay, I spent X amount of time in the year working, and apply that percentage to your total bill. So
yeah, and so the house has got solar. So if I got solar, would that cancel out any usage if you didn't work at night time and you sold it back to the grid?
Yeah. So yeah, the electricity accounting. This is where it gets into the nitty gritty. Usually, when we do electricity, we account for what you're taking from the grid, and then anything that you're generating is another line item, and it gets complex. Like, it depends on where it's going or whatnot, but it would generally count for nothing in terms of emissions. Without seeing it, I can't say if it minuses what you're taking from the grid, because there's complexities there, but generally it's not adding to your footprint. Yeah,
that makes sense. Thank you.
Thanks.
So Natalija, Thank you very much for that. I know you did have do you want to see the carbon calculator? She has got it, it's really quite mind-blowingly simple in principle. If you want to show it. In practice, it obviously gets more complicated, but.
Natalija mentioned in her previous presentation this morning that she just calculates this using Excel. So there's no special, software that you need to download that's going to cost you a lot in order to work it out.
Yeah, there are companies that provide programs for these kind of things, but I can tell you, even some of the biggest companies in Australia still use Excel for a lot of things. So it's so yeah, these are the equations. Like I said,
see those, Natalija, sorry.
Sorry?
We can't see your screen.
Oh, where'd it go? Okay.
Oh, wait, there it was. Sorry.
That's right, I'll get it back.
Huh, thank you.
Can you see it now?
Yeah, we see it now. Thanks.
Yeah, what you see on the screen is these are the calculations, and like I said, they're literally like grade 4 maths. But what becomes complex is getting the inputs into the top one. So getting the right quality of data depends on the emission source, but getting the right quality of data, and then depending on what that data looks like, getting the right factor to apply it to then get to calculate the tons of emissions. So getting the inputs on activity data is the complexity, and then finding a right emission factor. But generally, because a lot of businesses are, everyone uses electricity, everyone uses fuel, these factors are really common. So so for very common emission sources, the factors are there. It's getting the right data points. But yeah, it's like I said, they're quite simple calculations, just the inputs that can be challenging to get sometimes.
Natalija, for a small business, so, a one-person business working from home, to set this up, say at the end of financial year, when looking at a chart of accounts, you've got the total of all your power bills, your water bills, your fuel bills, all those costs that you can track to your footprint or attach to your footprint. What kind of cost would be involved for a business like that to say, hey, can you build me my Excel that fits my business?
It's quite small on the spectrum. Usually there's a bit of time at the start in setting up and assessing things, but if you're a one-person business and you pretty much have all your own data, it wouldn't be a very complex exercise, especially like as well as you don't have to quantify everything. Like a footprint, if you're a refinery or if you're a one-person business, you don't have to quantify 100% of your footprint. You focus on the big ticket items, and generally if you get 90 to 95% of it all, 85 to 95% of all, that's pretty good. And then the rest that are like the smaller sources, you just say, okay, I can't get data for these smaller emission sources. I'm just going to assume collectively they're like 5% more of the total. So that's called an uplift factor. So and also what's not shown on here in the emission factor example, what's not shown on here is usually as a first pass to estimate your footprint, there are factors based on dollar spend out there. So that's usually the easiest, but usually the least accurate footprint that you can develop based on general ledger data and dollar spend.
Okay, but there's rhyme and reason to the algorithms and the factors that you can add in to get a pretty good picture.
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you so much. I know it's really hard doing this remotely. Wish you were here. Have a lovely night, and I'll see you in the morning. Thanks, Natalija.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for your questions and your time. Thanks a lot.
Take care.